the infection of your meninges. So these are membranes that are around the brain. So they're not made of neurons or anything, like the brain is. They're just membranes around it. We're going to start from the outermost layer in. So the outermost layer is called the dura mater. In Latin, the word mater means mother. Dura means tough. So it literally means tough mother, like durable, has that same root word, because it's the thickest, most rigorous of the meninges. And it'll be the gray on the outside. So this entire gray layer here is the dura mater. Now there are two layers to it, which you can sort of see if you have really good eyes. These are a slightly different color on the outside and the inside, but you can really see it where they just kind of split it apart. Where, in the body it wouldn't be split apart this widely, but here on the model they split it apart so you can see the outside layer and the inside layer. The outside layer is called the periosteal layer. And then the inside layer is the meningeal layer. So I skipped over the dural sinus for a second. So the periosteal layer, that's part of the dura. The meningeal layer, that's the inner part of the dura. They're both gray. One's a slightly different gray than the other one. We're going to come back to that dural sinus in a minute. But this dura mater, it doesn't just surround the brain, it also extends into the brain, where if we look at the surface of the brain, you see this division here. So you can kind of pry it apart and look in here. There's a piece of dura that splits the two halves of the brain, the two hemispheres of the brain from each other. There's also a piece of dura that goes between the brain at the bottom and this, which is hanging off the back of the brain, which is the cerebellum. So there's a piece of dura that goes into here. The one that goes down through this, so it divides the brain into two hemispheres, that's the falx cerebri. And you can see it on this model, where you have kind of this face here, and his head is open, and we just have this piece. And this piece here is the falx cerebri. And that's going to go in right down the center of the brain, and it's going to hook onto the crista galli, like this little pointy part. So that holds your brain in place that way, so it bounce around. Now we're also going to see here the dural sinus, or you can call it the superior sagittal sinus. I would call it that because that's what you're going to call it in AMP2 also. That's what it is on the AMP2 list, kind of randomly. But the superior sagittal sinus, that's this blue line right at the top of the falx cerebri, so it's painted on. Now the piece of dura mater that goes over the cerebellum, so it separates just your brain, the regular part of your brain, which is called the cerebrum, from the cerebellum at the bottom. That's called the tentorium cerebelli, and it's the flappy piece at the bottom. So it makes a tent over the cerebellum. And you can see the tentorium cerebelli on here too, as this gray extension. Here's your cerebrum up here. There's your cerebellum. That looks like a little tree, kind of. And this gray, there's two pieces of gray that stick over it. That's the tentorium cerebelli. So that could be us on either of these models. Now, the falx cerebelli is going to divide your cerebellum into two hemispheres. We don't have a model for it, but just so you can visualize where it would be, if you look at the back of the cerebellum, here's your cerebellum, right here, there would be a piece going in that. So that would be where the falx cerebelli is. Since we don't have a model for it, I would ask it as a question. And that is the piece of dura mater that separates or divides the cerebellum into two hemispheres. So the falx cerebelli is a piece of dura mater that divides the cerebellum into two hemispheres. Okay, the subdural space. That's also something you can't see on the model because you don't have this unless you are terribly injured on your head or dead. Then you develop the subdural space. So the subdural space is what we call a potential space. Meaning it could become a space, but it's not right now. And it is between the meningeal layer of the dura and the next layer in, which is called the arachnoid mater. So if you think of two pieces of paper, one lying on top of the other, there's a space between them, kind of. I mean, they're lying right on top of each other, they're touching each other, but you could introduce a space between them. It's the same idea with these, this inner layer of the dura and this next meningeal layer. They're separate things, but they're laying right on top of each other, but you could make a space in them. What would cause a space to be made in them is fluid leaking into there. So if you got what they call subdural hematoma, has anyone ever heard that word before? So it's like when you get kind of like a sharp blow to the head, you can start getting fluid leaking in there. So that's not good. Yeah, Gina?
I think some of the lab manuals don't have that one in it. Like he has a word in there, but we don't.
Oh, how many people don't have subdural space? So kind of have to, well, here, write it down. Okay, so speaking of the arachnoid mater, which is the next layer down, we go back to this model. If we zoom in really closely, you will see a little thin orange line. That's the arachnoid mater. And it goes all the way around. You can see it here. If you have the more greenish version of this model, it'll be more of a peach color. Same thing, it's going to be orange or peach no matter which model you have. Getting closer to the brain, you'll see an actual space. You can stick your fingernail in it. There's kind of like a dark blue-ish color in it. That is the subarachnoid space. That is really a space. And in that space, you'll find cerebrospinal fluid. So obviously you can see the cerebrospinal fluid here, so that would have to be a question. I might say, what is in the subarachnoid space? Or I might say name a place where you find cerebrospinal fluid, and this would be one of them. We'll see others too. And then our last thing, right under the subarachnoid space, is the pia mater. It's this red line here. And if you have the kind of greenish model, it just doesn't have the pia mater on it. There's just nothing there for it. So it has to be asked on this one. It's right on top of what we call the cerebral cortex, which I'm jumping ahead just a touch, but it helps to know this now. So cerebral cortex is the outer layer of cells in the cerebrum. And that would be right under the pia mater. If you look, you'll see this sort of stripe. It's kind of a beige or khaki color. That's the cerebral cortex. It's not very thick. You're going to have just cell bodies here, and then it turns white. That's no longer the cortex inside. So if you were looking at this model, what you're touching here, this is the cortex. But if you just go a little bit in under that, it's no longer the cortex. So it's like an eggshell almost. Okay, so just to recap, you've got the dura mater, which is the gray on the outside. There's two layers to that, the periosteal layer and the meningeal layer. Just under that, you've got the arachnoid mater, which is the orange or peach, depending on the model. There it is there. The subarachnoid space is an actual space. You can stick your fingernail in there. Then the pia mater is the red line right on top of the cerebral cortex. The dura mater also has the tentorium cerebelli sticking out over the cerebellum. Or on this model, it's these flaps at the bottom. You've got the falx cerebri and the superior sagittal sinus. Falx cerebelli you can't see, but it would divide the cerebellum into two. Does anybody need to see meninges? Anything of the meninges again? Okay, so now we're going to think about the regions of the brain. So we're looking at the cerebrum. So now we look at these big brains. So when we're looking at this big brain, this outer part that we see, so all this stuff, the part that you think of when you think brain, what a brain looks like, this is called the telencephalon. And these regions are what we refer to as developmental regions. So I will ask them that way. I'll say what developmental region is such and such structure in. So you need to know these regions. I'm going to list the 5 and then I'll give you an example of how I might ask those after we go through the little parts of them. So we've got the telencephalon. That's the outside part that looks like a brain. Then we go deep inside the brain and you've got the diencephalon. Go a little bit farther down, it's the mesencephalon. A little more farther down, metencephalon. And And all the way at the bottom of the brain is the myelencephalon. Okay, so I'm going to give you a slightly weird analogy here, but I think this will help you to orient yourself around the brain. And once I show you, I think you'll see it pretty quickly. The telencephalon doesn't fit into this analogy. It's just kind of the outer parts. This is where you'll find the cerebral hemispheres. Which are just, one side versus the other side. So one cerebral hemisphere, the other cerebral hemisphere. So you're looking at the cerebrum right here. When we open this up, so we're gonna take this model, we'll take the big one to start, and we'll open it up. And you'll look inside, and now we're dealing with all this stuff in here. And does everybody see a seahorse looking thing in here? Like here's his head, here's his nose, he has a neck, and a belly, and then a tail. Does everybody see the seahorse? Okay, so we're gonna name all those parts, we're gonna give them specific names on the seahorse, but the diencephalon is the head and the nose of the seahorse. The mesencephalon is a really thin area, it's the neck of the seahorse. The metencephalon is the belly of the seahorse. Plus, he's sitting on a piece of coral or